This was the hub of operation during the Vietnam War.
For Seferina Yepes, every day is a walk through history.
Well, there are things that happen in your life that you can't forget.
She's the curator of the Clark Air Force Base Museum, formerly headquarters for the U.S. 13th Air Force, just north of Manila.
Well,
back then, she was a well-loved aide and speechwriter for a string of American commanders.
the good old days.
For Americans who served here at Clark and at the nearby naval base at Subic Bay, they were the good old days indeed. The most strategically important U.S. bases in the Pacific. Clark and Subic were a projection of American military power deep into Asia. The Philippines, one of the best R&R ports. But it all came to an abrupt end in the early 1990s with two dramatic events. An explosion of Filipino nationalism, demanding an end to the U.S. military presence here, and an almost simultaneous explosion of nearby Mount Pinatubo, which buried the bases under tons of volcanic ash. The Americans were gone within a year, and nearly everyone assumed that Clark and Subic were history too. Well, just look at them today. The Philippines has managed to pull off a conversion of the bases hardly anyone thought possible. Now called Freeport Zones, Clark and Subic operate today under the flag of the Philippines and are bustling with economic activity. Companies from Japan, Korea, Europe, Canada, and even the U.S. have come to set up manufacturing and production, while Filipino firms have moved in with shopping malls, housing, casinos, tourism. It's all pouring millions a year into the Philippine economy and might even help this country become another one of those famous Asian tigers. And there literally are Asian tigers here now as well. But more on that later. First, meet Filipino Senator Richard Gordon.
I've been a mold breaker since I was a kid.
He was mayor of the Subic Bay town of Olongapo when the U.S. Navy sailed away for good. That's him on the right signing the final handover papers.
We were very, very glum. We weren't looking forward to the day that we would see our lives, suddenly change overnight. These are people I grew up with. I mean, the whole base I grew up with.
Gordon was not going to let Subic Bay sink. He personally organized thousands of locals who had lost their base jobs into a volunteer army to repair and protect what the Americans left behind. And he kept pressing the central government to get involved. $10 billion in abandoned infrastructure was simply too good to waste. It took a couple of years, but the Philippine government finally realized what a gold mine it had. Today, President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo puts the promotion of the Freeport zones near the top of her economic agenda, reminding everyone that Subic and Clark are now very successful Filipino operations. With a skilled, well-educated English-speaking workforce, low operating costs, and tax incentives, Subic and Clark have now brought in nearly $6 billion in foreign investments, providing 3 times more jobs than the U.S. military days. And the U.S. now pays about $1 million a year for ship repairs, maintenance, and supplies. The U.S. ambassador says it makes good economic sense for both countries.
And it's an interesting shift, I think, for us, too. That we put into Subic, it's easy, it's convenient, the facilities are all there, and yet it's done privately.
Wherever there are former U.S. bases, of course, there are also the base towns, which were so dependent on them. Well, they too have had to learn how to adapt to life without the Americans. Although there are some old habits that are clearly hard to shake.
Angeles City, right outside Clark, is as raunchy as ever. But now, instead of U.S. sailors, there are tourists from Australia, Korea, China. Local officials say they're not happy with this, but the red light district remains a big source of jobs and city income until the economy matures, which it is doing. More legitimate businesses are now sprouting up, construction jobs are plentiful, and the old Clark runway is now officially an international airport, bringing in a new wave of tourists for other pursuits. Sports and leisure activities at Clark, ecotourism in the jungles of Subic, swimming with whales and dolphins in Subic Bay itself. And if all that isn't enough, there are those tigers we mentioned. At a Disney-style jungle safari, one of the most popular new attractions at Subic. It's certainly not what anyone would have imagined as the Americans left 17 years ago. And though she misses the old days over at Clark Field,
Oh, that was an emotional one.
Seferina Yepes says she couldn't be happier.
Clark, Subic are now all yours.
Yes, yes.
And how does that make you feel?
Pride. Pride.
For Worldfocus, this is Mark Litke in the Philippines.